Good morning, folks. I am very pleased to be welcoming back Bob Morrison to the studio. So now I'm pleased to invite to the stage Dr. Brad Stelfox, who I'll lead with. So Brad is, for more than 35 years, Brad has been a driving force in reshaping how Albertans and the world understand cumulative effects of land use. A scientist, educator, and thought leader, Dr. Stelfox has dedicated his career to helping policymakers, industry leaders, and communities make informed decisions about environmental sustainability. His groundbreaking work has influenced land management across Alberta and beyond, ensuring a balance between development and ecological integrity.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. Good to talk to both of you, Bob and Jenny.
Greatly appreciated. The thought about being somebody who's been working in water and land use for decades and suffering the consequences of the average person not paying attention to these vital things that we do. So thank you very much. I'm really pleased to hear more from you today.
Well, an Albertan, born in Edmonton, but kind of grew up west of Edmonton on a small ranch northwest of Stony Plain. My university background is primarily as a zoologist at U of A, and I had an opportunity after my undergrad to go to East Africa and look at land use, particularly livestock and wildlife in Kenya, where I lived for several years and also set up a university campus and taught there. And then came back to Canada, and where my wife and I raised a family. Had an opportunity to go down to Jackson Hole and work at the Teton Science School in Grand Teton National Park, looking at environmental relationships, dynamics, primarily environmental education, where I taught from basically 6-year-olds to 96-year-olds. So that was thoroughly enjoyable. We moved back to Canada, and that's where I started working with the provincial government for a few years, heading up the wildlife ecology program at then what was called the Alberta Environmental Center, and then kind of branched out on my own, starting to build some of the early cumulative effects models that tried to look at how a collection of overlapping land uses were reshaping the landscape of Alberta and other provinces. And that, of course, led to some opportunities with my colleagues who really helped build some wonderful software to look at these relationships in countries like the United States and Australia, parts of Europe, Southeast Asia. So that's what's kind of kept me busy over most of my career, Bob, is looking at the interface between humans and their landscapes, primarily through all the land uses that makes humans human, I guess.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I'll just offer that I saw you speak in Bragg Creek, where you were showing just that, how you would put, road use and agriculture use and oil and gas and et cetera, into these models to help us see how they add together and how they can cause what I would call deconstructive interference on the landscape.
Right. So, yeah, that's a good way of describing it. Yeah. There's a lot going on, and Alberta's a very busy place.
For sure. Yeah. Okay, go for it, Bob.
Okay, well, let's start off with modeling, because you've done quite an extensive amount of that. And there are economic models, there are water management models out there. There's some, I gather, environmental models in terms of what's the impact of one thing or the other. We're not doing so well in some cases on political models in terms of how decisions should be made. Where are the gaps in terms of making all those models work together that you see?
It's a good question. I mean, as you say, there's just so many models out there. And I think we as society struggle with scale and how we relate these models together. So, I mean, there's thousands of models that just deal with how water moves through the landscape, or how wildlife walk through habitat, or how people select the homes they live in, or how our climate may change, whether it's the next forecast for the next 12 hours or 2 weeks or next 18 decades. So there's an abundance of models out there. I think one of the historical problems that we as modelers have had is in linking effectively social, economic, and environmental models together. And our particular focus with the work that I've done and with the colleagues that I've worked with is trying to help people understand at a strategic scale that humans and their land uses all create benefits. They create social benefits. It could be, okay, if we have a commercial logging operation in an area, what does this mean to royalties and rents in that area that might help fund all sorts of infrastructure that's critical to the community, or just build a community of people that are making adequate money so that they can live together and have community. Those are examples, very roughly, of social benefits. Other people for any given area want to know how land uses create economic benefits. Again, the jobs, the royalties, the rents, how does this contribute to GDP? And those things are critically important. And I think most probably of listeners have heard of kind of triad approaches that are trying to help people understand the social, the economic, and the environmental effects. What we've tried to do is a good strategic job of quantifying social dynamics, economic dynamics, but mainly try to focus on how do land uses affect natural capital or environmental variables. So the landscape, habitat, carbon in the soil, the wildlife themselves or populations, biodiversity, water, both quality and quantity, and help people understand that all land uses, I guess, without exception, create benefits, social and economic benefits. I don't know of any exception to that. They also create liabilities. And so where we think a lot of historic models maybe struggle a little bit is that they don't do a good job of highlighting the trade-offs, the liabilities. And so my personal belief is too many models that are used by industry and government are looking for win-win-win scenarios. So we're going to have all the forestry we want, forest sector, logging and energy and mining and agriculture, whether it be livestock or crops and recreation and settlements. And if we're wise about it, we are not going to compromise water quality or water quantity or biodiversity or carbon. And I don't know of any examples on Earth historically where that's the case. It's all about trade-offs. And many governments, and I think the current administration in Alberta is basically spun a narrative that smart people with smart models can figure out how we can have it all, and we can't. And so our modeling approach has been to help people understand that there are trade-offs and that Alberta or any other jurisdiction needs to figure out what their priorities are and to make hard decisions about, where are we going to get our jobs from? Where are we going to produce our food? Where are we going to get our wood fiber from? How important is water? And if so, where are we going to get it from? Same with biodiversity. And instead, what I'm seeing is a hyper-exponential growth in almost all land uses and a narrative message from much of industry and certainly government that if we're just careful about this, we can do it all and have it all, or in fact we can't. And so any objective examination of the quality and quantity of water in Alberta today compared to when this place became a province in 1905, or biodiversity or soil carbon, shows an absolutely profound loss of natural capital. So clearly we traded off a lot, and I think the rate at which we're trading off what little remains, is alarmingly fast. So yeah, just a few thoughts on modeling anyway.
Well, and that comes, go ahead, Jenny.
Oh, I was just going to reflect back a little bit of what I heard. So from what I'm seeing, and you and I have talked about, I'm a liability expert as well. And the first rule I've learned is we don't talk about liability as much as possible. And so this is part of the problem, is we're not accounting for those genuine, risks to a continued freshwater source if we continue to take more than the system can allow. And so that's what I think you're describing. Is that correct, Brad? That we are taking more from the system in Alberta that will allow for the water and biodiversity to recover? Is that a good summary?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm actually, I'm pro land use. I have no problem with logging and mining and oil and gas and people and residential patterns and recreation. As long as we have people, we're going to have land use. The problem is the number of people that we have has grown so quickly. And the average, significantly normal human, their per capita resource use, like just looking at the three of us compared to our parents or our grandparents or our great grandparents, the water, the carbon, the land, the electricity, our footprint is so large compared to previous generations. So, the basic equation is, number of people times per capita resource equals true effects. And as Jenny indicated clearly, is with so much of the historical work, we have, I think, intentionally externalized natural capital. There is this trade-off, and we do not factor it in. And if we're going to have people, we're going to have land use, we will be using carbon, we will be using water, where there will be losses of biodiversity. And those systems can support a certain amount. We could call that the interest, but we're not taking water away at any sort of natural interest rate. We are profoundly cutting into the capital. We're literally choosing what this province has been around 120 years, I guess, this year. We have a profound loss in the capital of biodiversity. Like, I think many Albertans would be amazed to know that, pre-European times, if you just looked at mammals, they'd probably native mammals. So that would be all mammals except for humans or pets and livestock. That, they'd probably, we're not doing as well as we were, say, 300-400 years ago. We don't, because 300 or 400 years ago, they were like 99.2% of all biomass or numbers in Alberta. There were people, First Nations, and they had dogs. Most people would say, we're down, but we're not down to like 90% of, or 80 or 70 or 60 or 50 or 40 or 30 or 20. And a lot of people in Alberta would say, if you got friends in Argentina or Germany, come over to Alberta. It's this beautiful natural place. And maybe biodiversity or wildlife would be part of the attraction to bring them over. But we're not down. It's not like we have 90% of what we had. We're not down at 30%. We're not down at 20% of. We're not even down at 10%. Today, we're maybe 4% of what we had pre-European. And the severely normal Albertan doesn't get it. Part of it is shifting baselines, because this stuff, we've been losing it, at maybe 1.5% per annum. And so very few people effectively see these 1.5% changes per annum. And of course, we have some biodiversity, maybe white-tailed deer or coyotes that are doing really well. But en masse, we've just wiped out our native biodiversity and replaced it with humans and livestock and pets. And we've largely lost our natural capital in water, both quality and quantity. I mean, the water we have today is just unbelievably different qualitatively. Not many parents that want to throw their kids into creeks today, right? Because they get quite sick. Yeah, especially in the southern half of the province. And most of our creeks and the prairies they're just gone. I mean, they've been plowed over and put into canals for irrigation. So this goes back to what Jenny said, is all land uses require the use of natural capital. We externalize it. We don't factor it into long-term equations because, for the most part, Albertans and their governments they're me, here, now type of people. I'm an Albertan, and most of my friends are Albertans. I love Albertans, but our actions tell us that we're not really concerned about our kids or our grandkids. We're concerned about ourselves, and we're not concerned about regional landscapes. We're concerned about where we live. And, it's a me, here, now type of mentality, which is fundamentally externalized natural capital. And so we have grown economically, unbelievably. We have very affluent people, but in a province that has been mined of most of its natural capital. And all evidence is that we're going to accelerate that rate. So.
Well, most of us see natural capital and biodiversity and all those things when we go to a park.
Mm-hmm.
We go out to the mountains, we go out to Banff, we go to our local park and walk around and say, oh, isn't this wonderful?
Right.
Where are, in the southern part of the province, where are we most in trouble? If you compare, say, the mountains to the foothills, to the parkland areas we have, to the prairies, where are we having the greatest problems from what you can see?
Well, that's a good question. It has to, I would suggest I would think about it in terms of, let's say if you've got a bank account full of natural capital, whether it be water quality or water quantity or biodiversity or soil carbon. In southern Alberta, there's a very noticeable gradient from west, high elevation, to east, low elevation. I guess the good news is we're not losing a lot in the eastern lowland parts because it's already empty. There's nothing to lose. Okay, so if you have a bank account, you got 100 pennies in it, and 2 weeks ago, you ain't got no water, any more money in that bank account, I don't think you're worried about losing anything because there's nothing to lose. The biodiversity, the water quality, the water quantity in the lower eastern portions of Alberta is gone. So I'm not too worried about losing a lot there. The only way we could move is to talk about how we could reclaim it. Okay. And then people will point to an individual species of a bird or a mammal or a reptile that's doing reasonably well. And yeah, that's true. But if you look at across the board, the full communities, whether it be insects or birds, mammals, amphibians, in these landscapes that have been so heavily transformed by agriculture, water quality, water quantity, and biodiversity is basically gone. The ones that are at greatest risk right now, I would argue, are the foothills and the mountains, where we seem to have this attitude that we want to love them to death. We want to recreate in them. We've got this human population that's growing at 2% and quite affluent, and they want to recreate in motorized and non-motorized ways. We have a protected areas network, still quite small in many ways, larger than other people's landscapes and others, going from Waterton, Kananaskis, Banff and Jasper. There's places to go. Those places are full of land use, but they're primarily recreational, although there's a lot of residential too. If you think of places like Banff, Kananaskis has got a lot of residential. We have a bow wave of rural residential and acreage owners like what I used to do, or I used to live. So these landscapes, in many ways, are critical, which comes back to, I assume, one of the key topics of this interview, which is water. So I don't know, I think this province must be 800 billion cubic meters of water fall on it every year. And about 3/4 of that evaporates. So it's not available for land use because it's back in the atmosphere. And we probably have 130 to 150 billion cubic meters that will flow in streams and rivers or slowly in our aquifers. And then we use some of that. But that water, which in all land uses require water. We have a part of Alberta in the southwest part where it's high in elevation and it's colder, and a good chunk of that precipitation falls in the form of snow, and it accumulates through these winter months. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then in the spring it warms up, and we have this vernal discharge of water, and that is critical to our fish, our wildlife, and also our land use. In southern Alberta, we've got logging and we've got agriculture, both crops and livestock, and mining, and oil and gas, and transportation and residential. We've got it all, and they all need water. And those east slopes are absolutely critical. And it seems like somehow Albertans have forgot their original conversation with the federal government when those resources transferred to us as a province, which everyone back then knew. In the absence of all the amazing science we have today from the Pomeroys and Sachens and others of just how important these slopes are to water. And so they're there. It's an important land use. Just let them be, let them do their dynamics, let them accumulate that water, leave the organics in the soil so that some of that water can be absorbed and replenish aquifers, and allow them to deliver profound quantities of high quality water for downstream land uses. And now we are incrementally eroding that with every time we put more acreages or more roads or more people hiking that pee and poop in that landscape, and more cattle. But in an architectural sense, we have all of this logging that is just so profoundly changing the hydrology of that area, and its infiltration rates. So we're just treating these slopes as some sort of bank account we want to draw down in one generation, and we are drawing it down. So it is being destroyed at a stunning rate. At the same time, probably no more than maybe, 1.5% per year. And if you got 100 pennies in your bank account and someone takes out 1.5, so next year you got 98.5. The average severely normal Albertan doesn't detect that, and on it goes. But over a few generations, it's all gone, and we're mining it down so quickly right now, in my view, anyway.
Well, and I know in terms of ranching, and you came from a ranch originally, that there are many ranchers who would say, yeah, we agree, but tell us what to do and make sure that we can still survive as ranchers. How do you somehow accomplish that with a land use that's already established? How do you make sure that those folks can still be viable? You're not, and unless you're going to kick them off the land, and still be able to protect the environment in the way that they would like to protect it.
Well, I think first you admit, if you believe in an empirical world in science, that it's not protected now. So it's not a matter of we need to protect it for something that's coming. We're already dealing with something that is being profoundly transformed. Your question is still bang on, Bob. I think you need to recognize that landscape can receive some land use. So the first thing is, what should the east slopes be for? I mean, maybe their destiny is we just log the heck out of them because we as Albertans can just accept completely damaged water quality. Okay, well, that's a decision, I guess, in a society, if they want to make that decision. And others would say, well, no, its priority land use is oil and gas or cattle or recreation or coal or. But right now, the answer is we think it can sustain all of it, and it can't. So a blunt conversation, like the Alberta Land Stewardship Act was designed to do, which is recognizing that we need landscape legislation that says you can't do everything everywhere all the time. You need to figure out what the priorities of the landscapes are. And of course, in East Slopes, and even Elsa said, that's a great example. It's for watershed protection. And then you could ask the question of what land uses can occur. So if you did that, then I think the answer would be what land uses could be compatible with water quality and water quantity, because there's no part of Alberta that gives us more water quality and quantity than Southwest Alberta. And then you could look at cattle and crops and logging and mining and rural residential in that context. So if we're losing it already, I think the first thing we need to do is stand back and say, we're already in trouble. We have to start looking at reclaiming these landscapes. And we have to, instead of growing, because all these land uses are growing. Like logging is a land use that, even though I think it's over allocated, it's growing. We're finding ways.
Accelerated, right.
Yeah.
It's accelerated growth, not just growing. Yeah. Sorry, keep going.
It is, yeah. And we already have a bow wave of rural residential that are living up and down these slopes, and that's growing. And we have an oil and gas sector, and many people would like to see it grow. Coal mining would be an example. We could conceivably mine commercially valuable deposits of coal, right up to East Slopes. That's a scenario that has been seriously entertained, as everyone in Alberta knows. In recreation, we could say, well, we need another 15 or 20 Canmores, because wouldn't that be wonderful? And we could increase the number of livestock on it. So if it were me, I would say, what kind of land uses would be compatible with water quality and quantity. And so then those are different things. So some land uses, like agriculture, is massive on the water use side. And I've got to say, I'm quite impressed by many, not all, but many of the local ranchers who do a pretty good job of putting cattle on these foothill landscapes and keeping them out of streams and keeping their densities low. And they're there and encouraging native grasses and the kind of soil dynamics that let water infiltrate. But not all of them, but many do. But those cattle, like the others in Alberta, I think we've got about 4 or 5 million head of cattle, they all go to feedlot systems. And those feedlots need, well, every cow needs to eat 2.5% of its body weight per day. And they're not getting that from feeding on any field. They're in feedlots. They get that from literally tens of millions of hectares of cropland that are grown, much of it even on the irrigation side, which needs water. So, like, I'm a pretty big advocate of sustainable cattle ranching. I'm not a big advocate of feedlot systems, but our livestock system in Alberta is, I'd say, entirely based on feedlots, at least in terms of number of animals that are processed, well over 98%, and tremendous water. And so we have the cattle ranchers going, we need feedlots, we need good quality water, so let's not damage it upstream. I get that. But they are by far the biggest users. And then, of course, irrigated crops for humans too, which a lot of humans. So I would be looking at what kind of land uses can exist, and more importantly, how to conduct them. And I think quickly you'd start looking at logging and forestry and say, well, first of all, I think we'd back up. The eastern slopes and their forests, these are disturbance ecosystems. There's nothing wrong with disturbance. Ever since glacial ice sheets retreated, 14,000 years ago, these systems have been kicked into midsection regularly by fire, by insects, by floods, by droughts. There's nothing wrong with disturbances, and we still have them. And because of climate change, we're actually radically changing the intensity and the frequency of natural disturbances. So it's now an anthropogenic system. So that's a problem in and of itself. But in addition to that, we have all these land uses which are disturbances. So the disturbances are additive. It's not like we've removed natural disturbances and just put human-made ones on. We are logging at a very high intensity. We need roads to get up there. It's causing an immense amount of sediment, which is going into our streams, bigger streams yet, rivers and downstream. We are removing so much carbon. The amount of carbon that's being able to decompose and maintain organics in soils is going down. So we're doing a poor job of holding and absorbing and replenishing that water into aquifers. So logging, there's just too much of it, and we're not conducting best management practices, even though the forest sector and the government would say we are. I think there's often a fairly good agreement as to what best management practices should be in terms of, for example, how many residual green trees should be left in cut blocks, how big cut blocks should be, what is the rotation age, how far back from large creeks and rivers should we go before we log anything. Our practices in reality are different than the best management practices on paper. And then best management practices, I would say, are essentially useless if industry doesn't actually implement them. And if there isn't an enforcement to monitor, then you don't have a good system. So we have a lot of logging, but when I look at it, it is not configured in a way that fundamentally respects the value of water. And just the number of roads, the number of crossings, the number of hung culverts, the amount of sediment getting into it, the shift and reduction in our age class structure, and the changes in biodiversity. So that's just be an example of one land use that could be conducted in East Slopes, but I would say at far lower rates and with fundamentally different practices. And the same with mining, if you want mining. But why would you put mines at the headwaters, these water towers that everyone realizes nothing nothing's more important than water. So why would we want any land use that is going to interfere with the quality of water in these headwaters? And why would we let off-highway vehicles up there? Why would we allow in municipal lands acreage owners to build right on riparian habitat? First of all, it's a liability for them and floods. And secondly, those landscapes are critical to flood dynamics and they need to be allowed to do their own thing, right? So what I would suggest, Bob, is kind of a bottom-up biophysical strategy that recognizes these ecological processes and say, okay, how much disturbance can they take? What land uses could we fit in and how much of them? And in the East Slopes, I just can't imagine where we'd be more careful with those discussions than there, I would think.
Well, wasn't that the purpose of the Eastern Slopes policy back in the 1970s?
Yeah.
Kind of say, okay, how much can we, what's our carrying capacity and where should things go?
There were a bunch of thought leaders, you know, I'd call them the Lauren Fitches and Cheryl Bradleys of the world, who back then, of course, those two were part of those conversations, you know, and people that could very clearly see the degradation in natural capital that was occurring on the East Slopes. And so there was some very progressive, encouraging discussion about the role of East Slopes and that what we could do or couldn't do. But at the same time, Alberta is for the most part, pretty right-leaning, economic-driven. You know, this is a province where we need to see our economy grow rapidly. And so land uses need to expand so we can attract risk capital and we can get high profit margins. And I mean, just look at the land uses we have today in Alberta, whether it be forestry, energy, agriculture, transportation, residential, recreation, or I don't know, whatever. Today, they're all, if you read their business plans of either industry or government, they're all unacceptable today to their own sectors. And why? They're all unacceptably too small. They all have to grow. And they've all experienced exponential growth, but they're unacceptable. So they're, you look at their 5 or 10 or 20-year plans, no one says, we're going to hold our own. We're all going to grow. So it was against that backdrop that those early discussions on the East Slope said, okay, we just can't allow that to happen. But we've had a series of governments that said, we're smarter than the rest of humans on Earth. We can make it all, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have win-win-win-win-win-win scenarios. So just because we're so smart. So we can put another 300,000 residential homes in riparian habitat, and as long as we do it well, there won't be a problem. We can put another 15 coal mines into the headwaters of the East Slope, and as long as they all adopt best managed practice, there's no problem. We can put more cattle. We can mine these landscapes for gravel. We can have rural residential, urban sprawl. It's just nothing's going to be adversely affected because, we're just so damn smart. And the evidence suggests that there's no truth to that at all. But it's a great mantra. Yeah, severely normal Albertan goes, yeah, that's what being an Albertan is. We're just smarter than everyone. And how else could I buy my fourth pickup, unless this whole system continues to grow? So the whole system is based on this insufferable grow. And it's all at the expense of natural capital. And so if we can do that elsewhere, we can certainly do it in these slopes. It's kind of sickening.
I'm wondering, Brad, if you can unpack a little bit, because you touched on something that is obviously very close to my heart, which is the land use management programs. So I would describe that work. So I had a view of it when I was in the industry, and we were looking at, I'll be specific. We were looking at caribou habitats, and we were looking at restoring those habitats by 2060. And part of the the issue with those conversations I saw is that it's very what does that mean for humans, right? We hear this concept of species at risk, and I understand it to be, that's an indication of ecological health. And if those species are intact, then your ecological system is intact. And so that's a very, I would say, for the average Albertan, that's not really something that is, resonates with them. So I'm going to share a short story. I was at the Water and Land conference for the Athabasca Fort Chipewyan First Nation in September. And they were talking about Indigenous land rights, like access to traditional ways of living kind of thing. But the challenge I see when you talk about, biodiversity losses, we've also had Indigenous community losses as well. So I look at, and I'm curious how you would describe this, Brad, because I look at all of us living in a basin should really think about having those traditional land, access to those traditional land rights, meaning if we don't have caribou, then there isn't a sustainable like a sustainable food system, let's say, in our watershed. And I would say the same thing for, trout species. That's another example of species at risk so that to me is the purpose of those. And I think that's often lost on people, that when we talk about species at risk, we're ultimately talking about the human species being at risk. And, you already talked about how we are overstretched right now. We're not in a position where we have this option to say, well, let's just keep going. We are keeping going, but it's going to lead to catastrophe, meaning we will have a breakdown in our water system. Or, I'm thinking of, I'll be specific, around Lethbridge. We just heard Chris Spearman explain that, we've got piped water 100 meters around Lethbridge. The same thing in Edmonton since the spill that was experienced in Wabamun Lake and Two Hills, all the way out to those areas. That's a 150 kilometer radius around Edmonton that is sustained by Edmonton's water system.
Right.
So these are the ways that we have taken more from the bank account than we can sustain, which will lead to catastrophe ultimately if we do not make restoration the center of our economy. So is that a fair summary of what you're arguing? So we need to look at these land uses and say, which are the things that need to cease and which are the things that we can sustain in a way that will serve us both locally and, I don't even know if globally will be an option if we do let it break. So I don't know if you can sort of clarify what I said here in terms of the how do we help people understand what it means to be restoring and what that looks like in terms of those difficult conversations?
The Alberta Land Stewardship Act, and I can't even remember when it came out. I want to say 15, 20 years ago. It seems like yesterday. It was a omnibus piece of legislation that was supposed to ride over top of all other types of legislation and precipitate the conversation, Jenny, you just talked about. And it started it, but I think once, and I saw a fair bit of appetite for it at the community level or for the severely normal Albertan, but I think once industry and government understood that conversation would lead to, hey, we have to stop growing the total amount of water we take out, the total number of cubic meters of wood we harvest, the total amount of cubic meters of natural gas or conventional or bitumen or shale gas or whatever that we extract, that there needs to be a limit maybe on our livestock population. Some people said, well, you know what, this could mean that we need a limit on number of people. And everyone got, oh my God, who said that? It became a very awkward conversation. And the initial efforts within the land use framework to do this work well and show the trade-offs were just politically, they're just non-palatable. And I also saw, and unfortunately, I think I detected that people could have that conversation theoretically, but in their own watershed. And of course, it's another person, people we all Albertans say, when I'm in the watershed, there's never been an Albertan who's ever got out of the watershed, right? We're always in the watershed, so we should remind ourselves. But anyway, when you start talking about people's individual watersheds, it could be the Upper Bow or it could be Red Deer or Athabasca, that there needs to be trade-offs in terms of growth opportunities, in terms of the primary resource sectors. People became very quiet and would ask, well, what does this mean to the funds coming into my municipality or my job or maybe even the performance of their investments in the stock market. It just reminded me in a very sobering way that this is a fundamentally difficult, maybe impossible conversation for humans. Only a very small fraction of them seem to be able to be willing to actually change their behavior today to not only stop the growth of these land uses, but as Jenny was saying, how do we put money and effort and time into reclaiming them so that we might have streams in the future, which are the ones that our grandparents talked about putting their kids in, or drinking water that is not treated chemically or physically, or being able to see the suite of wildlife. So if I'll just say we've lost 96% of our native wildlife. Native mammals and birds are very similar. Insects, we really don't know. But we're sitting with a grade of F- right now. Maybe we want to reclaim it back to a C. Well, that would take tens of billions of dollars. And most people, they might think it's a good idea in theory, but the effort and the money, they're going, no, I'm really, my primary concerns are the Flames going to win tonight and what kind of pizza am I going to order? More important things like that. So, yeah, people struggle with this conversation immensely, I think.
It's so fascinating. Like you said, it's, how low do we have to go before we finally change? And yeah, it seems like we aren't there yet, at least in Southern Alberta. We're still going to play this game. But I do think that those pressures are coming, Brad. I don't know how they're accumulating, if you will, because it is different pressures from different areas that will, potentially lead to one of these catastrophes, like you said. When we had our conversation about water transfers with Davin McIntosh, the one example he used where the water, the fit for allocation system broke was in a feedlot. That was the precise example he used, that there was not enough water to provide for them who were lower license, or lower ranking in the fit for model.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore the ranchers had to make those trade-offs to make sure that those feedlots were able to sustain themselves. So I definitely think those types of situations are the things that we should be looking for, as those big signals that something is needed rapidly. So if you were to start somewhere,
Jenny, I would be curious, how well are those scenarios embracing the full suite of what if scenarios on climate change? And looking at the probability of intensity and duration of droughts, because the ones that I've looked at are looking at some variances, but not the kind of variances that I think are reasonable relative to the work of Bill Donahue and David Schindler and Dave Sachin tell us about the magnitude and intensity of droughts that we're likely to experience. We've been unbelievably secure in our water for so many decades, and that's in a non-climate change scenario. So we have every good reason to expect that we're going to be dealing with a whole lot less water in the future, just because of natural dynamics that should reappear, plus all the climate change scenarios. And we're building a demand complex in Southern Alberta that is highly unlikely to be met by the kind of future water availability we're going to encounter, I think.
Right.
Well,
I see.
Go
ahead.
I
was just going to say, go ahead, Bob. Go.
We'll be talking to Dave Sachin in a future podcast.
Good.
I think it's next week, or maybe it's this week. I don't remember.
Any closing comments that you wanted to offer, Bob, and then maybe a last question for Brad before we set him free? Thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead, Bob.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for the questions.
Yes, thank you, Brad. It's been very, very informative, very great discussion. Do you have any hope that we can get around this kind of a problem where we need to maybe even get into degrowth rather than growth exponentially?
I think I'd answer this question differently today than maybe 10 years, but I think unless Albertans and more broadly Canadians want to have a heart-to-heart about not only the benefits but the liabilities of growth economies, I don't know how we rationalize the fact that economies need to grow and deal with environmental issues. I think we have to rethink our economic models if we want to see a pragmatically helpful discussion on how to manage natural capital. Because a continuous growth economy, I don't see examples where it's effectively internalizing natural capital. Maybe in words, but not in practice. So,
right. Yeah, I mean, we decided that growth and that, you know, the oil standard was our economic backbone, and we can decide that water is, and that
yeah.
could be our focus. So it's certainly something that I think we need to come to grips with as a country, and specifically, as you said, as Albertans in southern Alberta, we have to cherish those eastern slopes and start fighting for their restoration, because to me that is the 80-20 rule. If we can get after that and make sure that we are preserving that sacred area, then we have a hope of restoring the rest of it too. Is that true?
I wouldn't disagree. I think that would be a good first step. And I don't think that's anti-business. I don't think it's anti-economy. It's just like, let's define an economic model that actually makes sense and perhaps does a good job of allowing our great-great-grandchildren to have a healthy lifestyle in a landscape that has some reasonable natural capital, because right now the prospects, I think, are indeed poor.
Yeah. Well, I am sure committed to making sure people understand this and moving us forward. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Or sorry, Brad. Thank you, Bob, for getting this going for us. I'm really pleased to be back in conversations around water, and I look forward to hearing the rest of them. Just lastly, please remember to like and subscribe to the Gravity Well so that we can make sure that these important conversations do have a broader reach for the precious time that Brad offered us today. So thank you so much, Brad, and have a good rest of your day, everyone.
You guys too. And thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.